Chapter 11. Cassie flinched, her heart thundering, and her head spinning. What do you mean? The hush of the library was like a blanket absorbing all sound. Instead of answering, Julian removed his hand from hers and traced a circle with his finger in the dust that had gathered near the partition between the desks. In the centre he drew a flower with 5 petals. He looked up from the drawing and fixed her with a hard stare. You protected us, yet you say you don't understand. Cassie shook her head and exhaled a short, hard breath of frustration. Julian, please. He examined her face quizzically now. You really don't know? Cassie's stomach squirmed and her face reddened. Again, a child who knew nothing. Before Julian could explain further, Ali appeared, carrying a thick, old-looking book covered in grass-green cloth, embossed on the spine with faint gold lettering. She placed it onto the table in front of them, disturbing a puff of dust that rose and landed in a thin film over Julian's drawing. This is what I was looking for, she said, triumphant, opening the book to the middle and flicking through a few pages. Here. She ran her finger down several paragraphs until she stopped, stabbing halfway down the page. This is it. She shifted the book so that Cassie and Julian could read it. The night is good Halloween, the fairy folk do ride, and they that would let true love win, at Miles Cross they maun bide. It's part of Tam Lin, said Ali, a Scottish folk ballad thought to originate from some time in the early 1500s. This version is from 1791, one of those collated by Francis Child. They looked at her blankly. She sighed. The old stories encode a lot of lore. What I want to do has been done before. Halloween, see? Julian frowned. But that's over 6 months away. Not for us. She turned a few pages. Look at this next version. The morn at even is Halloween. Our fairy court will ride. Through England and Scotland both, through all the world wide. She paused as though waiting for them to catch up. Through all the world wide, which means us in the southern hemisphere as well.
But their Halloween's in autumn, and our seasons don't exactly match theirs. If you go by the Coolin seasons, we have 7 of them, said Julian. True, but it's not so much about seasons. Halloween, or its older name, Samhain, traditionally represents an astronomical cross-quarter date, a midpoint between the solstice and the equinox. The Earth has shifted slightly in relation to the stars since it was first designated. In the northern hemisphere, the Samhain cross-quarter now occurs around the 7th of November, and the equivalent southern hemisphere cross-quarter date this year is the 5th of May. That's only a few days away, said Cassie. Exactly. And for whatever reason, stories across the globe suggest that this is the time the veil between the worlds is thinnest. The dark cross-quarter, our last chance to harvest what we planted, find what we have lost. Cassie shivered. Find Thomas, you mean? Ali glanced at her and took in Julian's startled expression. Yes, and also maybe... She trailed off, looking at him. He took a deep breath, then nodded and lowered his head. Ali's whisper carried easily in the stillness. Julian's mother. Cassie gasped. A man at the nearby desk looked up from his work at them. Cassie waited for him to return to his reading, her whole body shaking. Violetta. Her name caught in Cassie's throat. Julian met her eyes, and she could see all the grief etched there, as though he had lost her only yesterday. And she saw something else too, a sense of determination in the set of his chin, as if he were challenging her to disagree with him. But I don't understand. You can't bring her back from the... She couldn't continue. She couldn't say the word. He shook his head. She's not dead. Was this how he dealt with her loss all these years? Why he hadn't wanted to talk about her? because that way he could believe that she was still present somehow, still alive somewhere. She opened her mouth, closed it again. And how had Ali become involved? Why was she encouraging his delusion? She turned to Ali, trying to read her motivation. They didn't really know her, after all. What if she were leading them astray, pulling the two of them into something darker, a cult, a coven, or whatever was going on here? Suddenly the hush of the library seemed to press in on her, its domed walls pushing in from all sides like a cocoon. She would not let herself be torn apart and remade into whatever creature this young woman wanted them to become. It was time to leave, to simply head to the station, catch a train, and find her way home. She could do it. She knew where she was now. She stood up and pushed her chair back. A flicker of confusion crossed Ali's features, but it was Julian who spoke to her in a loud whisper. "What are you doing, Cassie?" "I'm going home." "But I need you." She turned around, fighting the pulling feeling in her stomach, and her words came out as a snarl. "I thought you said your kind doesn't like my kind, whatever that means." Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Ali's eyebrows dart upwards. Julian let out what sounded like a disparaging laugh. "You've got it backwards." Cassie felt heat flashing across her cheeks and a roaring like the sea in her ears. "Cassie, will you at least let us walk with you?" said Ali, standing up quickly. "No." She strode to the door that led out of the reading room. Ali caught up. "Please, I owe that to your parents." "I'm not a child," she hissed, striding through the doorway. Julian appeared beside her. Cassie turned in exasperation, then looked from his face to Ali's and back to his again. She had promised herself she wouldn't walk off on them again. Where was that resolve now? She slowed down. "I know you're not," Ali was saying. "Let's go somewhere we can talk more freely then. Can we do that?" Cassie breathed in and out, trying to steady herself. "Fine, but you need to tell me everything or I'm going home." Ali led them up a staircase to a quiet nook by a window with a couple of soft couches. Ali sat on one, and Cassie flung herself onto the other, while Julian leaned against the window frame, staring out at the sky with an unreadable expression. Ali bent forward and touched Cassie's knee. "It's understandable that you're in a bit of shock. What you've experienced over the last 2 days would be enough to cause most people to book themselves into a psych ward." She paused, and Cassie felt that breathing might stop Ali from talking. She took a quick gulp of air and tried to look calm as Ali scrutinized her. Whatever Ali saw on her face seemed to encourage her to continue. "But you're mentally tougher than that. I knew it as soon as I began helping you with your schoolwork. You grasp things quickly and you're eager to see through puzzles, to get to the truth of things." A quiet laugh came from Julian's direction. He had his hands in his pockets and was watching a pigeon preening itself on a nearby roof gutter. Cassie glanced at him, frowning, then turned pointedly back to Ali. "Go on." "I've been searching for my friend Thomas for almost 6 years now, learning all I could about how I might gain access to the world between worlds. I've had help. One of my dearest friends, Nellie, has also been keeping her ear to the ground for me. A few months ago, she heard tell of a family with an ancient duty, a role that they and their descendants have been carrying out for generations. One member of this family moved to Curwood about 20 years ago and began a family of their own." Julian turned from the window. Cassie could feel his gaze on her now. "I was curious," Ali continued. "I thought I might learn something from this family. I knew where they lived, and at first I was simply going to call by, find out what I could, and leave. But honestly, I was a little—" She glanced at Julian, who was listening intently now. "Wary. I wasn't sure the direct approach would be entirely safe for me. I felt I had to find out a little more about them first. I discovered they had a young person at home who didn't go to school, so I left a letter in their mailbox with my number and website offering my tutoring services." "My family?" Cassie could feel her brain struggling to catch up, jumping from fact to fact as though each one was a fast-melting iceberg in a boiling sea. Ali nodded. Now I see that your parents would have arrived in Curwood about the time that your father," she turned to Julian, "brought home his new bride. Would that be right?" Julian narrowed his eyes. "Yes, I'd say so." She turned back to Cassie. "Haven't you wondered how you could do it?" "Do it? You mean that thing with the flowers?" Ali smiled. "Yes, that thing with the flowers. Did your mother teach you?" Cassie frowned, trying to remember. "No," she said, slowly after a time. "I don't think so. Dad has taught me more about plants than Mum. He tends Mum's herb garden for her. She just tells him what she wants in there." "Interesting." Cassie felt her face grow hot. "I didn't know what I was doing, you know. It wasn't like a conscious thing." "Did it feel as though it was just flowing through you?" She turned to Julian, surprised that he'd spoken. He had uncrossed his arms and was eyeing her with more curiosity than anything else now. "Yes, that's exactly what it felt like." "I get that," he said quietly. "You do?" Cassie breathed out and leaned against the back of the couch. "Yeah, when I play piano, sometimes tunes just arrive and my fingers play them. But they're like visitors. If I don't catch them, they're gone, off out the window like they have somewhere else to be." Cassie nodded, hearing a medley of Julian's haunting melodies run through her mind. The ones he had captured, she supposed. "That's pretty much what it's like." Ali nodded slowly. "Well, that makes a kind of sense. I didn't know that could happen, but then again, I didn't really believe your kind existed until recently." "My kind? You two keep saying that." Clouds were knitting together outside the window behind Julian, and Cassie shivered, remembering the tug of the smothering fog. "Will you tell me what my kind is?" Ali wet her lips with her tongue and turned to look behind her, checking, Cassie supposed, that their alcove was empty. Then she leaned in. "You, Cassie, are descended from a very long line of spirit weavers. Some people would call them witches, but that's just one of their names. These wild witches or solitary green witches are those whose magical skills are wrought from the land, from an understanding of and communion with plants and wild creatures and elements of the earth. Others might call them shamans. It just depends where you are in the world, really. As far as I can work out, the spirit weaver who was your descendant came out here on one of the early ships from Europe. Prior to his or her arrival, the work was, and in many places still is, carried out by local spirit weavers. Nellie tells me that as a child she met one of these local weavers and that this particular spirit weaver was powerful enough to rescue her own lover from the world between worlds. They had a son, whom I met." Her voice grew quiet, wistful. "His name was Jack." She trailed off and turned to the gathering clouds. "What happened to him?" asked Cassie quietly. Ali's eyes flickered and she smiled. "I believe he's still carrying on his mother's task. There are spirit weavers in both our world and the other, working from both sides, if you will." It was hard to find words after that. Cassie supposed that all that Ali was saying must be true because she could feel no protest anywhere within her at this revelation. It was as if she'd already known it. A vision of her mother's locked book, currently hidden under Cassie's bed, floated in her mind's eye, and she felt again the knowing that it was a thing of moonlight, of the night. A fierce longing for her mother overcame her. The longing was a visceral thing, squeezing her heart. She buckled over, brought her hand to the ache in her chest. Lyra would have known what to do, could have explained all this to her. She rocked a little, the way Mum had rocked her in her arms as a baby. This was not how it was meant to go. She saw it in a flash. There would have been a rite amongst the trees, a solemn ceremony under the gaze of the bright full moon, and she would have been gifted with the correct words, the right knowing. Centuries of faces of young women, their hair wreathed in flowers, flashed like cards being flipped before her eyes. All those who had gone before her. That was how she should have found out, with her mother's hand in hers, linked to all the grandmothers before them, connected back to the ancient way, the first spirit weaver in her family, the first wise daughter. "It was a woman," whispered Cassie. "What?" said Ali, blinking. "It has always been the women in my family." Julian's stare grew hard. "Don't ask me how I know," said Cassie quietly, turning to stare outside at the grey sky. "I just do."